Can you feel it? Can you see it? Can you hear it? Can you smell it? Can you taste it? Do you sense it?
Hi, I'm Amy and this is Connect. Thank you for joining us. We're going to explore the mind-body connection, journey down the path of enlightenment together, and have a little fun along the way. Let's start with a few deep breaths. The purpose of the breaths are to relax our body and rewire our brain. We're going to breathe in, I am calm, and breathe out, I am grounded. I breathe in, I am calm. I breathe out, I am grounded. I breathe in, I am calm. I breathe out, I am grounded. Today's topic is going to be suicide. We have 3 guest panelists with us today to discuss the complexities and the pain and the potential healing and prevention of suicide. Starting with Sandy Morningstar, body-centered therapist. Hi Sandy, thank you for joining us.
Hi Amy, it's good to be here.
Wendy Halley, shamanic healer. Hi Wendy, thank you.
Hey Amy, it's good to be here.
And Ron Thompson, psychologist. Thanks Ron. Sandy, where do you think we should start with this painful issue?
Well, I think there are a number of families grieving because of suicide. And I think that one of the things that is historically true about suicide is that there used to be a great deal of judgment around someone who took his own life or her own life. And this is historical in our religious patterns. It's historical in our cultural patterns. And I think one of the things that can help us, particularly if we're going through a grieving process, is to try very hard not to hold any judgment about whether this act was right or wrong or good or bad, but rather focus on the fact that we are sad for the person that we've lost and that we can help each other as surviving families and surviving friends by celebrating the part of the person's life that was wonderful.
Those are very important points, that so many people spend time wondering, what could I have done differently, and is it my fault? Whose fault is it? Trying to find blame or trying to understand it, and some things just that aren't understandable.
That's right. Sometimes we're very angry at a person who's committed suicide. But I think that anger comes from a place deep down inside of us, which is more like panic, that I didn't know, that I couldn't help, that I didn't do anything, that I didn't foresee what was going to happen.
Whoever wants to answer this next question, what are some of the precursors to suicide, some of maybe the symptoms that someone is experiencing before they commit suicide?
Well, first of all, affect and the content of their conversation, what they're talking about, how their attitude toward life, those kinds of things, and one thing that I look for is a consistency between what they're doing and what they're saying, and there's a sense of reality about their social presentation. In suicide evaluation, or looking for this in clients, there's a process that that can be gone through where you you take several times in their lives and you have them talk about it, and it starts with a long time ago. You listen to the narrative, and then you step it back until the present time, and that's an indicator as to the amount of negativity or those patterns. You look for the patterns of despondency and those kinds of things. With regards to responding to someone who is talking about suicide, suicide shows a very radical kind of despondency, overwhelmed, and usually overwhelmed in terms of loss, either sadness, which indicates the loss, or anxiety, which is a projected future loss. So both those affects are extremely, or can be extremely painful. And so what the person needs is empathy for the sadness, and also a sense of reassurance for the future. Not an argument. You don't get into an argument with a person about, oh, that's not true. You're really a great person. You don't do that. You're looking for the need behind it, and the need in both cases has to do with loss.
Mm-hmm. Who's at high risk for suicidality?
Well, I was going to say, one of the things that I've noticed, or I've come across, and I don't know if you guys have come across this or not, but when someone is successfully suicided, and in talking to the family members or friends of someone who's suicided, there's usually a great deal of surprise, shock, because they didn't see it coming. And this is what I found, is that there's people who have suicidal ideation, maybe as part of their depression, and maybe they'll make suicidal gestures. And so their family members would know, but they haven't successfully been able to kill themselves. But the people who I have found, not across the board, but in general, more than not, I should say, the people who've successfully suicided, no one saw it coming, and there were no signs ahead of time, is what I found. And then, of course, the survivors have this tremendous amount of guilt, like retracing all the conversations and the patterns and trying to figure out, what did I miss along the way? And then it's, maybe there's like subtle cues, maybe, they started saying goodbye, they started, maybe giving some things away. But it seems like if somebody really wants to kill themselves, they're probably, if they're really set on it, they may not say anything. They may not give any clues to anybody, and just take their lives.
There's a lot of people, like you mentioned, suicidal thoughts are fairly common in depression. And we sort of evaluate people on, there's a thought, then there's the plan, and then there's the intent to follow through on the plan. And many, many people have the thought, why should I even be here? I don't even want to wake up. It's too much work to get out of bed. But they want to live. The thoughts are there. They may be thinking about death, but they don't want to die. They want the thoughts to go away. They're not pleased with the thoughts. Sometimes they just accept the thoughts, but they're not actively pursuing it. When you get to the other end where there's the intent, it's often with serious anxiety and feeling overwhelmed and feeling a need to escape from the pain. And there's some confusion and some impulsivity. Not every time, but that seems to be a little different. Can you speak to that a little bit, Sandy, about the impulsivity and or the need to escape?
I think one of the things that happens in our emotional young people who commit suicide is that there is often anger underneath the attempt or the act itself. That anger, I've heard little children say, I'll be dead and you'll be sorry. There's a way of coping with the loss that Ron was talking about, the loss of a girlfriend, the loss of a boyfriend, the loss of something really important in their life that makes their self-esteem hit the bottom. Mm-hmm. And so they turn that anger on themselves and they say, okay, the only way out is just to kill myself. But there's anger, there's despair, there's depression, anxiety. A lot of those feelings that we, as normal adults, have to cope with are very difficult for our more vulnerable populations to cope with.
They're very difficult for all of us to cope with. And then if you have a vulnerability, I mean, it's making me think of the broken heart. Yes. Having a broken heart, it takes a lot of work and effort to get good at getting through a broken heart. And when it first happens, sometimes you feel like you're going to die. You may not want to, but the pain, if you're not used to that brokenness. And so through time, we get better at handling it, but it can be anything from the end of a relationship to, well, different kinds of ending, someone passing, as we're talking about, or a breakup, our first love, or losing our dream job, or, the end of something, a broken heart. And it's excruciatingly painful. And to figure out how you're going to get to the other side of that pain, if possible, and not be overwhelmed by it. And I think sometimes what happens with suicidal thoughts is you miss the sadness and the anger, and you go straight to, I need to get out of here. Because you're actually having a hard time connecting with the grieving and getting in touch with the grieving, and you don't know how to release the pain. If you could cry it out, then maybe there'd be some relief, or if you could talk it out, but you're so overwhelmed by whatever's happening inside of you that you're having a challenge with it.
Yeah, that perspective. In a word, what it has to do is it's a confusion between needs and strategies for taking care of needs. Mm-hmm. And an example of this would be a person who would say, well, I have to have her. I have to have her as a partner. I have to have this. I have to have that. And what that is a confusion. The strategy for taking care of the need is to be in relationship with that one person. But the need has to do with love, has to do with acceptance, has to do with other kinds of needs, and universal human needs. And if we're not in touch with our universal human needs, we're really flying blind, because the world is changing around us all the time, and one strategy will work one time. And I don't mean to demean the idea of a relationship as a strategy, but on the other hand, I do believe that that if it's love that we need, there's certainly more than one source, and in fact, there's a multitude of sources. And I think the suicidal person, or the person who is extremely depressed, there's a tunnel vision that sets in, and usually it has to do, is correlated with the fact that they're locked into one strategy, and that strategy doesn't work. So if it doesn't work, then they're lost. And the greater picture, and as I work with people who are severely depressed, one of my intents is to bring in a larger picture, get them out of the tunnel vision, so that they can get their needs met by a variety of strategies.
Mm-hmm. Mm. I think that's an excellent point, and one direction to go in is I want to go somewhere else first. What would be helpful for families, people, communities who are being impacted by suicides? What would be helpful for them to heal from this?
Well, I can try to tackle that one. Well, at least a piece of it, maybe. And I think this subject of suicide has been taboo, and so talking about it openly and making it not such a well, here's the thing, and again, that I've worked with in the past, is that people are, if they suspect that someone is suicidal, they don't want to use the word suicide with that person. You know, have you been thinking about killing yourself or hurting yourself? Because they're afraid that if they say that, they're actually going to be planting that thought in the person's head, and then they're going to be the ones responsible for killing them if they end up suiciding. So I think, you know, talking about it, education around suicide and what's really going on with someone, and the responsibility piece and all of that, I think that's a piece of it. What do you guys think?
Well, I would agree with you entirely about the discussion, that's talking about it. If I suspect that someone is suicidal or is showing those kinds of gestures, I will go directly and ask them, you know, do you have suicidal thoughts, or is that what's going on with you at this time? Mm-hmm. And it's a matter of, you know, when they're in that state, it's a tremendous lonely state. You know, they've shut out social supports. They're going into their own thinking, tunnel vision thinking process. And so just to directly address it can be a relief, I think.
When you say tunnel vision, it's interesting because the more stress we're under in general, the more we get this tunnel vision, and the idea that we become more and more autistic-like in our ability to see our environment. And in my opinion, stress and anxiety go hand in hand. If the stress isn't dealt with, the anxiety increases, and then the anxiety is what's leading to confusion. So once someone's in that state, and so say you ask them, are you suicidal? What happens next? And they say yes, what happens next?
Well, I think the next step in that conversation is, how would you do it? Because you need to know how committed they are to a particular plan. If it comes off as kind of a nebulous thought that, oh, I just feel like I want to do it, you probably got a little time to do some work. I think the more awareness we have in our communities and in our social organizations and in our churches and religious and spiritual organizations, that we need to make the communities aware of the fact that there are lots of places that people can go for help. Even if a young person or an older person is contemplating suicide, the fact that it's in the community awareness that people are talking about where you can go to get help, that people can talk about peer groups that can help, that people can talk about medical professionals who can help. If a person is contemplating suicide over a period of time, knowing where these resources are and knowing how they can get in touch with them are food for thought for any person who has any doubt within himself that maybe this would be a pretty dreadful thing. I might even go so far as to say that with this kind of information out there, even the person who impulsively suicides successfully may have more of a chance in a split second to think about the possible alternatives. I know often older people will suicide around terminal illnesses. Young people will suicide in anger over loss. And these things are very impulsive. They don't have a plan. It just sort of moves in on them. They pick up the gun, they pick up the rope, they just do it. And I think the more the subject is open to discussion, the more the more we don't judge it, the more we don't say, no, it's really bad for you to commit suicide, you shouldn't do that. The more we can say, I empathize with how you feel. It must feel terrible to feel like you have no option except to take your own life. There needs to be a community blanket of catchers, of safety nets, of places. I would suggest that in schools where children have taken their lives, that peer groups get formed somewhere along the line. So if a student is really feeling like there isn't anybody to talk to, there might be a peer group with feelers out that could draw someone into that peer group and say, hey, we care a lot about you. It looks like you're going downhill. How can we help?
That's a nice idea. Well, I think one thing that I want to emphasize is that there are tremendous, I want to re-emphasize what you've said, that there are tremendous resources out there. And if you've been working with someone, if you're suicidal and if you're depressed and feeling suicidal, or you're feeling overwhelmed and you're seeing somebody and it's not getting better, keep searching. See other people. Ask who's been suicidal and who's helped you get out of these suicidal thoughts, and don't give up. Just go, find resource after resource, and you will find somebody who understands what you're going through and who can help you get to the other side of it.
And that's the point of the understanding. That's what I'm talking about the empathy. Right. What people need in that situation is empathy, not argument. Mm-hmm. They don't need to be argued out of the process. In a way, they need to be loved with empathy into opening up their options.
Mm-hmm. Let's face it, I think every human being on the planet has at one point thought, in a bad time, wouldn't it be easier if I was dead or gone or whatever? And I think you touched on the teenage years. I think that's particularly challenging. Like when you're a teenager, it's rough, man. You couldn't pay me to go back and be a teenager. And I wasn't bullied. I didn't have, that rough of a time. I was just pathetic, but, but it's your worldview is so small when you're a teenager, and to think, and so your options seem so limited. So I can understand why somebody who's an adolescent would think that that's a viable option, that suicide is a viable option. Mm-hmm. Especially if you're having a rough time. People are picking on you or whatever is, stuff's going on at home. Yeah, but I think it's normal to have those thoughts at times. It's just there's a spectrum though, and some people get locked in and they can't escape those thoughts.
Well, it's interesting. That's a really excellent point, in that sometimes when the thoughts get locked in, it's a sign that the anxiety is so high that they have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and the OCD is the obsessive thought. And they can't get it out of their mind, and that makes them think that they're actually supposed to go through with it because they can't get... It's the idea that we all have scary thoughts, potentially deviant thoughts, but if we're not obsessive compulsive, the thought, we go, ooh, that was weird, and the thought goes away. But if we have obsessive thinking, we have the thought and say, what's that trying to tell me? What's that mean? Am I supposed to do that? And then we give it much more credit and validity than it deserves. And that's how people can get into suicidal and or homicidal thinking or confusing, they can get really confused. So the answer, another way of looking at this is if you or someone you know is obsessively thinking about it, we're dealing more with anxiety than depression, and it can be treated in a much different way. It's not as clear, it's very different than just treating depression and suicidality with depression. So there's a lot going on, and again, there's lots of resources and lots of different practitioners that can help someone who's suicidal.
I'd like to address the issue of shame here. During the Depression, of course I'm old, so my parents at least remembered that, but there were people who committed suicide, many people who had had spectacular and wonderful careers, who managed their money so well they became quite wealthy. And all of a sudden, when the bottom fell out of the market, they were poor. And the fact that they carried such a great deal of shame around failure. I've failed to do this right. I've failed to foresee this coming. I've failed my job. I've failed my company. I've failed all my investors. Whatever it was at that point. Shame can drive us to thinking about suicide because we don't want to face the world with what has happened. We turn a lot of blame onto ourselves. And we need to be careful of that.
So the need in that case would be a need for self-esteem, a need for self-love. And so as we go through our process, if we're so overly invested in what we're doing in our strategy for getting our self-needs met, our self-love met, then we're setting ourselves up for vulnerability. And so that goes back to what I was saying about the need. If the need is for love, for self-love, self-acceptance, and those kinds of attitudinal needs, then it's very important for us to know that we really do have those needs, and our portfolio is just one way of one source, but there are many other sources.
It appears that we could talk about this more, but our time is up. So I want to thank you, Sandy Morningstar, Wendy Halley, and Ron Thompson for being part of this discussion.
Thanks.
This has been Connect. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week. Visit our website, connectwithamymiller.com.
You can feel it. You can feel it. You can see it. You can hear it. You can smell it. You can taste it. You sense it. You are connected. 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 You are connected.